I mean, what's
She came home from the airport 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here, and like about 12:10 and that afternoon, her friend Nicole showed up at the door. Like I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, say, but she never got back to me. But she wasn't getting back to any of her people as well. And that's what really concerned a lot of people is like, if she's not getting back to her, like if she doesn't get back to me, that's fine. Like she gets busy during the day, but she didn't get back to her people, which was very concerning. And Nicole called me when she was at the door, and that's when I came home.
A serial killer comes about by circumstances and like a recipe: poverty, drugs, child abuse. These things, contribute to a person, to a person's frustration and anger, and at some point in life, he explodes. Our desires, whereas if I didn't give in to them, I would be crushed by them. I believe in the evil in human nature. This is a wicked world, and in a wicked world, wicked people are born. I'm not going to blame society, my race, or people, or anything. It is up to the individual like myself to keep on knocking on whatever door they want to get into.
Yeah, 5:30, and then the bathroom. Got these clothes here on, and went to the bathroom and basically got in the truck and left. And drove off. I got to where I was at, but called Sherry to wake her up, get her going. She didn't answer, of course. Yeah, and so I went home to the gym, to Gold's Gym, and over by Ronnie's Plaza in South County, and started working out. I text her at some point. Might even have called her again. I don't remember. I could probably look at my phone if you want me to.
Do you guys have a home phone number too, or just cell phones?
We just use cell phones. So I text her, and then she still didn't respond, and probably now it had to have been well after 6 o'clock sometime when I texted her or called her. I'm sure it's still on her phone what time it was. Okay. And she didn't respond. It's not like her because the kids should have been up and stuff, or getting up and going by then, I believe. And so I called her again. On the way back, or when I was getting ready to leave, and she didn't respond again, and I started getting a little concerned because it's not like her not to answer the phone. Sometimes she won't answer if she's in the shower, but she always calls me back right away. And so she didn't do that at all. And so that's when I called you.
So what time did you guys go back? The second time? 6:23 a.m. is when you first texted her this morning to see if you're awake. That's all right. Okay. Did you try to call before that?
In a courtroom in Florida. He is representing himself. He is charming. He is articulate. He is confident. He smiles at the judge. She smiles back. He is also a serial killer, responsible for the deaths of at least 30 women. But right now, in this moment, none of that matters to him. Right now, he's performing, and he loves every second of it. There is a man standing on his front porch in Colorado. He is answering questions from a news crew. His eyes are red. His voice breaks at the right moments. He speaks about his missing wife and daughters like a man who cannot breathe without them. His family has been missing for less than 24 hours. He buried them himself the night before. There is a man in Wood River, Illinois. He carries a Bible to work. He sends his boys to school with packed lunches and handwritten notes. He is the head of security for one of the most prominent Christian ministries in America. He is also sending threatening letters to his own wife. He is building the story that will justify what he is about to do. There is a man moving through the darkness of East Los Angeles. He is not hiding. He wants to be found. He wants you to know his name. He will carve it into the walls of the houses he enters. He will stand in open courtyards and look up at the cameras. He will blow kisses to the jury at his own murder trial. Because to him, the attention is the whole point. 4 men, 4 cities, 4 lives that looked, from the outside, like lives worth admiring. 4 men the world trusted. 4 men who used that trust as a weapon. This is the story of what happens when a man loves himself so completely, so absolutely, that everyone around him becomes disposable. This is the story of narcissism and the beautiful, terrible monsters it creates. The anatomy of a beautiful monster. The psychological framework. Before we name them, before we walk through what they did and how they did it, we need to understand what they were, not who, what. Because the question that haunts every case in this documentary is not how they killed. It is how they lived among us for so long without anyone seeing what was right in front of them. And to answer that question, you need to understand one word: narcissism. What narcissism actually is. The term gets used loosely, casually. We call arrogant co-workers narcissists. We call difficult exes narcissists. We have watered it down into something almost ordinary. But clinical narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, is not ordinary. It is not arrogance. It is not selfishness. It is a fundamental restructuring of how a person experiences reality. At its core, narcissistic personality disorder is the inability to perceive other people as fully real, not a failure of empathy, though that is present, a failure of basic human recognition. To a true narcissist, other people are not people. They are props. They are mirrors. They are tools. They exist to reflect back a version of the narcissist that he finds acceptable. The moment they stop serving that function, the moment a wife becomes inconvenient, a child becomes a burden, a victim becomes a witness, they cease to matter. They cease, in the narcissist's internal world, to exist at all. The spectrum. Psychologists place narcissism on a spectrum. At one end, the executive who takes too much credit in meetings. The influencer who cannot stop talking about themselves. Manageable, irritating, not dangerous. At the other end of the spectrum, the cases you are about to hear. At this extreme, narcissism fuses with something darker: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy, the complete clinical absence of conscience. What emerges when these things combine is not just a difficult person. It is a predator who has learned to perform humanity so convincingly that the people closest to them never see the danger until it is too late. The mask. Every man in this documentary wore a mask, but here is what makes them different from ordinary criminals. They did not just wear the mask, they became it. They were not men pretending to be good husbands, devoted fathers, charming neighbors. They were men who had constructed an identity so complete, so practiced, so deeply internalized that they could deploy it on demand, in court, on camera, at the school gates, in the church pew, without a single crack showing. And that is the most dangerous thing about a beautiful monster. You cannot spot what you cannot see. You cannot run from what looks like the man you love. 4 men: Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, Chris Coleman, Chris Watts. Different decades, different methods, different masks, but underneath, the same hollow architecture, the same inability to see beyond themselves, the same certainty that their comfort, their desire, their image was worth more than the lives of the people they destroyed. We begin where the blueprint was laid. We begin with the man who taught America what a beautiful monster could look like. We begin with Ted Bundy. The image. Ted Bundy was, by every external measure, exactly the kind of man you would want your daughter to bring home. He was handsome, not in a flashy way, in a reassuring way. Square jaw, easy smile, the kind of face that belonged on a campaign poster. He was educated, a law student, an aspiring politician. He had worked for the Republican Party of Washington State. He had been personally praised by a future governor. He volunteered at a suicide prevention hotline where he talked troubled strangers through their darkest moments with patience and warmth. He was, by his own description, a passionate, dedicated young man with a bright future. He was, in reality, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The architecture of a predator. Bundy's kill count has never been definitively established. He confessed to 30 murders across 7 states. Investigators believe the true number is significantly higher. His victims were predominantly young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. He has never fully explained why. Some profilers believe it traced back to a woman who rejected him. Others believe it was simply the face of vulnerability he had learned to target. He was organized, methodical. He used his appearance as the weapon. He would approach women in public spaces, campus buildings, parking lots, ski resorts, often wearing a fake cast on his arm, asking for help carrying something to his car. He used the social contract against them. The unwritten rule that says, this man looks safe, this man looks educated, this man looks like he needs help. I should help him. That rule cost 30 women their lives. At minimum. The narcissism unmasked. What set Bundy apart from other killers of his era was not just the scale of what he did. It was the way he did it, and the way he spoke about it afterward. When Bundy was finally caught, tried, and sentenced to death, he did something extraordinary. He fired his attorneys and represented himself. Not because he thought he could win. Not because he had a legal strategy. Because the courtroom was a stage, and Ted Bundy was not willing to let someone else have his spotlight. He cross-examined witnesses. He made legal arguments. He addressed the judge with a familiarity that bordered on flirtation. And the judge, Judge Edward Cowart, told him at sentencing, "You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner." Bundy received that compliment in a death penalty hearing for the murder of a 12-year-old girl. And he smiled. The confessions. In the final days before his execution in January 1989, Ted Bundy gave a series of interviews to FBI agent William Hagmaier and psychologist James Dobson. He spoke about his crimes with a detachment that was almost academic. He referred to his victims as entities, as items. Ted Bundy was genuinely, clinically curious about himself. He found his own evil interesting. That is not narcissism wearing a mask. That is narcissism at its most complete. A man so consumed by his own inner world that even his capacity for violence became just another thing to contemplate about himself. The legacy. Ted Bundy was executed on January 24th, 1989. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate. People held signs. People cheered. Bundy had asked to be cremated and have his ashes scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. He got his wish. The families of his victims got far less. Many never received confirmation of what happened to the women they loved. Bundy took that information with him. Even in death, he found a way to retain control. That, too, is the narcissist's final move. Ted Bundy didn't just kill women. He killed the idea that monsters look like monsters. He made America look at a handsome, articulate young man, and taught us too late what we had failed to see. The Devil's Disciple. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. If Ted Bundy was a narcissist who hid his darkness behind a carefully constructed mask, Richard Ramirez was a narcissist who burned the mask and wore the darkness like a crown. Between June 1984 and August 1985, Ramirez terrorized Los Angeles and San Francisco in a wave of attacks so chaotic, so apparently random, that investigators struggled to establish a consistent profile. He broke into homes at night. He attacked the elderly and the young. He used guns, knives, hammers, tire irons. He did not have a consistent victim type. He did have a consistent signature. He left pentagrams on walls, on bodies, scratched into skin. He told survivors to tell them the Night Stalker was here. He wanted credit. He wanted a name. He wanted to be known. That desire, the hunger to be recognized for his violence, is the purest expression of narcissistic evil we will examine in this documentary. The Making of a Monster. Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, the youngest of 5 children. His early life was, by clinical standards, a blueprint for the worst possible psychological outcomes. His father, Julian, was volatile and abusive. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran with severe PTSD who showed the young Ramirez photographs of the atrocities he had committed overseas, including images of women he claimed to have raped and murdered during the war. Ramirez was approximately 10 years old when he witnessed Miguel shoot his wife in the face during an argument. He absorbed all of it. Criminologists who studied Ramirez agree that the combination of childhood trauma, early exposure to graphic violence, and a complete absence of psychological intervention created something that was, by adolescence, almost irreparable. He began using drugs heavily as a teenager. He gravitated toward Satanism, not as a spiritual practice, but as an identity, a framework, a way of understanding himself as something beyond ordinary moral constraints. In Satanism, Ramirez found permission. The narcissism in the courtroom. Richard Ramirez was arrested in August 1985 after being recognized and beaten by a crowd of residents in a Los Angeles neighborhood. He was tried on 63 counts, including 13 murders. The trial lasted over 3 years and became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in California history. Ramirez performed throughout. He arrived in court in expensive suits paid for by female admirers. He flashed a pentagram drawn in his own palm at photographers. He smiled at cameras. In a moment that remains one of the most chilling images in true crime history, he turned to face the jury as they delivered their verdicts and said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." He was not performing for the court. He was performing for the world. To Ramirez, the trial was not a reckoning. It was a platform. The women who loved him. During his trial, Richard Ramirez developed a following. Women wrote to him, visited him, brought him gifts, professed love. The phenomenon, now studied in forensic psychology under the term hybristophilia, describes the attraction some individuals feel toward violent criminals. Ramirez exploited this completely. In 1996, while on death row at San Quentin, he married freelance magazine editor Doreen Leoy, who had written him over 75 letters. He had found, even in a death row cell, an audience, a mirror, someone to reflect back the version of himself he wanted to see, powerful, desired, significant. The narcissist doesn't stop needing the mirror. Even in a cage, he finds a way to construct one. The God complex. What separated Ramirez psychologically from Bundy was the absence of calculation. Bundy planned. Bundy controlled. Bundy managed his image. Ramirez wanted to be caught, not consciously, but in every behavioral choice he made, he left himself exposed, identifiable, visible. Because the point was never to get away with it. The point was for the world to know it was him. That distinction is critical. It marks the point at which narcissism stops being about self-preservation and becomes something closer to a God complex, a need not just to be admired, but to be feared, to be mythologized, to be permanent. Richard Ramirez died of B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013, at San Quentin State Prison. He was 53 years old. He never expressed remorse. Not once. Not in 30 years on death row. He died the way he had lived, convinced to the last that he was the most important thing in any room he entered. Ramirez didn't want to get away with it. He wanted you to know it was him. And for the rest of your life, you would never forget the shepherd, Chris Coleman, the perfect family man. There is a particular kind of evil that wears a cross, not because faith produces evil, but because faith, like charm, like reputation, like a good neighborhood and a clean car and a packed church pew, is armor, and some men know exactly how to use it. Chris Coleman was, by every public measure, an ideal man. He lived in a quiet neighborhood in Columbia, Illinois, with his wife, Sherry, and their 2 sons, Garrett, aged 11, and Gavin, aged 9. He was employed as head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the most recognized Christian evangelical organizations in the United States, personally protecting Joyce Meyer and her family. He was the man you called when you needed someone trustworthy, when you needed someone steady, when you needed someone good. He was, in the language of the church, a shepherd. He was also, methodically, deliberately, over several months, constructing the murder of his entire family. In 2008, Chris Coleman began an affair with Tara Flenner, a woman he had met through his professional network. The affair was serious. He told Flenner he wanted to be with her. He told her he was planning a future. But there was a problem. Divorce was not an option Coleman was willing to consider. Not because he loved Sherry. Not because of the children. Because of the job. His employment with Joyce Meyer Ministries was contingent by contract on his maintaining a public image consistent with the ministry's Christian values. A divorce, especially one involving an affair, would almost certainly cost him his position, and Chris Coleman had built his entire identity around that position. Without it, he was nobody. So the family, Sherry, Garrett, Gavin, had to go. Not through divorce, not through separation. They had to be erased. The setup. Beginning in late 2008, Coleman began laying the groundwork for what he planned to do. He sent threatening letters to Sherry and to Joyce Meyer's ministry, claiming an anonymous enemy was targeting his family because of his faith work. The letters were graphic, violent, and specific. They described what was going to happen to his wife and children. Coleman reported these letters to police himself. He walked into the station, concerned husband, devoted protector, and handed over evidence that he had created. He was staging a scene, writing a script, casting himself as the grieving survivor before the crime had even been committed. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, Chris Coleman drove to a gym in Waterloo, Illinois, and worked out. At some point during the previous hours, he had entered his home and strangled his wife and both sons in their beds while they slept. He then drove to work. When he returned home that afternoon and discovered the bodies, he called 911 and performed the grief he had been rehearsing. The arrogance. Inside the Coleman home, spray-painted across the walls in large letters, were threatening messages. The word "punished," references to the letters Coleman himself had sent. Police found this not chilling, but instructive, because the spray paint was neat, controlled, done by someone who had time and stillness, done by someone who felt no urgency, no panic, no fear, done by someone who was absolutely certain he would get away with it. That certainty is the narcissist's fatal flaw. They are so consumed by their own intelligence, so committed to the performance, that they cannot see the gaps in their own logic. Coleman had also been recorded on surveillance cameras at the gym during the window of time he claimed to have been there. The timestamps did not match. Investigators subpoenaed his phone records. His text messages to Tara Flenner told a story his lawyers could not undo. Chris Coleman was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder in May 2011. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The reckoning. At sentencing, Sherry Coleman's family stood in court and described the woman he had taken from them. Her father, Warren Smith, addressed Coleman directly. He told him that he had not just killed a daughter, he had killed joy, he had killed light, he had killed something that could not be replaced. Coleman sat and received it with the same expression he had worn throughout the trial. Flat, controlled, present in body only. He had been found out, he had been convicted, and still, there was no crack in the mask, because the mask had long since fused with the face. He protected a minister for a living. He couldn't protect the people sleeping under his own roof, or rather, he chose not to, because protecting them would have cost him the life he valued most, his own. The good neighbor, Christopher Lee Watts. The family Shanann Watts was 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant with a boy she planned to name Nico when she was murdered by her husband in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. Her daughters were Bella, 4 years old, Celeste, 3 years old. She had just returned from a work trip to Phoenix, Arizona. She was tired. She was excited about the baby. She walked through the front door of her home in Frederick, Colorado, just after 2 in the morning. Her husband was waiting. Within hours, he had strangled her in their marital bed and smothered both daughters. He loaded their bodies into his work truck and drove to the Weld County oil field where he was employed. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were fed, feet first, into oil storage tanks. He drove back home. He made himself coffee. He went to work. The performance. When Shanann's friend called police on August 13th, after being unable to reach her, officers went to the Watts home. Chris Watts met them at the door. He was cooperative, calm. He walked them through the house with the measured concern of a husband who was worried but not panicking. He showed them Shanann's medication. She was not the kind of person to leave without it. That afternoon, a local news crew arrived. Chris Watts agreed to speak with them on camera. What followed became one of the most studied pieces of footage in the history of behavioral analysis. He described his marriage as wonderful. He said he had hoped his family would come back. He described his daughters who were at that moment submerged in oil tanks 4 miles from where he was standing, as his precious babies. His eyes did not match his words. His gestures were slightly off, the micro-expressions of a man manufacturing emotion in real time, deploying what he had observed grief looks like without having any access to the actual feeling. Investigators who reviewed the footage said they knew within minutes. He knew they knew. He confessed the following morning. The affair. His reason, or rather, his stated reason, was Nicole Kessinger, a woman he had met through work, a woman he had been involved with for approximately 6 weeks before the murders. He told investigators that on the morning of August 13th, he had choked Shanann during an argument, that it had gone too far, that he then made a decision about the girls. Investigators and prosecutors did not accept this framing. The evidence suggested premeditation. The oil field location, which required specific access credentials, had been researched in advance. This was not a man who snapped. This was a man who decided, who calculated the cost of divorce, the house, the debt, the image, the inconvenience, and decided that this was cheaper. The confession tapes. In 2019, Chris Watts sat down for an extended jailhouse interview that lasted several hours. It has since been studied extensively by criminologists, behavioral analysts, and psychologists. What struck everyone who watched it was not what he said. It was the absence of what he did not say. There was no grief. Not real grief. Not the kind that lives in the body, in the breath, in the silences. There was no moment where he broke. He spoke about his daughters in the past tense, with the same flat tone he used to describe his commute. He spoke about Shanann with a clinical distance that felt almost inhuman. At one point, he said he wished he could take it back. Investigators noted that the wish seemed to be less about them and more about the situation he now found himself in. He didn't miss his family. He missed his freedom. Why Watts is the most unthinkable. Of all 4 men in this documentary, Bundy, Ramirez, Coleman, Watts, Chris Watts produces the most visceral reaction. And it is worth asking why. Bundy was a known criminal, eventually. Ramirez was a terrifying figure who operated in darkness and declared himself a monster. Coleman had at least a discernible, if horrifying, logic. Watts had none of those things. He was a utilities worker in a suburban neighborhood in Ituacitwa, Colorado. He drove a work truck. He had a wife he coached youth football with. He had daughters who brought him drawings from preschool. He was not exceptional. He was not dramatic. He was not magnetic or threatening or strange. He was ordinary. And that is the thing that keeps people up at night. Because if Chris Watts could be what he was while looking exactly like everyone else, then the question is no longer about him. The question becomes, how many others are there? How many men are sitting at dinner tables right now, smiling at their children, performing love they do not feel, calculating quietly in the backs of their minds how much their families are worth? Chris Watts didn't look like a monster. He looked like your neighbor. He looked like your husband. He looked like everyone. And that is exactly why he is the most dangerous man in this documentary. The pattern. The thesis. 4 men. 4 decades. 4 different American landscapes. And one pattern that runs through all of them like a crack in the foundation. What they shared it was not violence. Violence is a method, not an identity. It was not opportunity. Opportunity is circumstance. What these 4 men shared, the single, consistent, unifying thread, was the absolute inability to assign full human value to other people. Bundy's victims were entities, objects he collected and discarded. Ramirez's victims were an audience, witnesses to his power. Coleman's family were liabilities, financial and reputational risks to be managed. Watts's family were inconveniences, problems standing between him and the life he wanted next. In each case, the victims were never truly people to the men who killed them. They were never fully real. And once you understand that, once you understand that this is the core malfunction, the central wound, the engine of everything, the question of how it happens becomes the most important question we can ask. How it happens. Narcissistic personality disorder does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning label. It develops over years, often in childhood, often in environments where the individual was either excessively praised or chronically invalidated, sometimes both simultaneously. It hardens into a worldview. I am the center. Others are peripheral. My needs are the only needs that count. Left unchecked, it spreads. It shapes relationships. It shapes parenting. It shapes the way a man looks at his wife across a dinner table and calculates, not whether she is well, not whether she is happy, but whether she is still useful. Every man in this documentary had people in their lives who saw warning signs and could not name them, who felt something was wrong and talked themselves out of it. The abrupt rages behind closed doors that never appeared in public, the way disagreements were handled, not with conversation, but with cold withdrawal, with punishment, with silence. The way the love always felt slightly performed, slightly too perfectly calibrated to the audience. The warning. Forensic psychologists who study intimate partner violence and family annihilation have identified consistent pre-incident indicators in cases like Watts and Coleman. Escalating financial stress that the partner conceals, new romantic attachments that the partner minimizes or hides, a sudden shift in affect, the withdrawal of warmth, the quiet disappearance of engagement, and perhaps most critically, the moment when a narcissistic partner begins to see the family unit not as something to be sustained, but as something to be escaped. That is the most dangerous window. That is when the calculation begins. Not every narcissist becomes a killer. The spectrum is wide, and most people with narcissistic traits move through the world causing pain without ever taking a life. But every single family annihilator, every intimate partner killer, every man who has looked at a sleeping house and decided, these cases carry the same fingerprints. A man who could not see the people he lived with as real. A man who had long since made himself the only person in the room that mattered. The mirror always lies. We began with 4 fragments. A courtroom, a front porch, a gospel hymn, a city at night. We began with 4 men who looked from the outside like men worth trusting. Men who had mastered the performance of decency so completely that the people closest to them, the people who shared their beds, their homes, their lives, never saw what was underneath until it was too late. Ted Bundy looked in the mirror and saw a brilliant legal mind, a future, a man the world had underestimated. Richard Ramirez looked in the mirror and saw a god. Something beyond punishment, beyond consequence, beyond the ordinary rules that governed lesser men. Chris Coleman looked in the mirror and saw a man of God whose comfort was sacred, whose career was worth more than the lives of his wife and children. Chris Watts looked in the mirror and saw the main character, a man whose desires were so central, so absolute, that an entire family became nothing more than an obstacle to them. Each of these men looked in the mirror every single day and saw someone worth protecting, worth lying for, worth killing for. And the mirror, as it always does, told them exactly what they wanted to hear. The tragedy is not just what they did. The tragedy is how long the world looked at them and saw exactly what they wanted to be seen. A charmer, a rebel, a shepherd, a good neighbor. 4 beautiful monsters. 4 mirrors that showed us nothing but lies.